Every console has that one game. That game that defined the system. The one everyone remembers. The one people still argue about 30 years later. So today I'm doing something extremely dangerous. I'm picking the best game for every console I owned. From the NES all the way to the Switch 2. And yes, I'm absolutely going to make people angry. So let's start in 1985 with the NES. The Nintendo Entertainment System was my first console, and yes, I had to share it with my brother, which basically meant gaming time was decided by whoever grabbed the controller first. The NES originally released on July 15, 1983 in Japan, on October 18, 1985 in the United States, and only later arrived in Europe on September 1, 1986. This 8-bit console quickly took over living rooms everywhere and launched with Super Mario Bros., which is still considered one of the greatest 2D platformers ever made. But in my opinion, it's not the best game of the NES. For me, there can be only one, and that game is Contra. Contra released on the NES back in 1988, developed by Konami, and it's basically the video game equivalent of an 80s action movie. You play as Commandos Bill Riser and Lance Bean, sent to an island near New Zealand to stop an alien invasion. Because apparently, when aliens attack Earth, the logical response is two guys with machine guns and no shirts. The gameplay is run and gun chaos. You jump, shoot, dodge bullets, and try very hard not to die every 3 seconds. And that was pretty hard back in the day. Games didn't have a save functions like we have now. You had to complete the game in one sitting. Power-ups like the legendary spread gun turn you into a walking bullet hurricane, which is about the only thing keeping you alive. This game was brutally difficult, like throw the controller at the TV difficult, which is why the famous Konami code became legendary. That little cheat code gives you 30 lives, which finally made the game almost fair. Contra is still considered one of the defining action games of the NES era, and proved that in the 80s, solving alien invasions mostly involved running right and shooting everything. This was my favorite game, and if you disagree, feel free to be wrong in the comments. The Sega Master System was released in 1985. This was Sega's first real attempt to compete with Nintendo's NES in the 8-bit era. Technically, the console was actually more powerful than the NES, with its sharper graphics and better colors. Unfortunately for Sega, Nintendo already had a massive head start and dominated the market almost everywhere. But if you grew up in Europe, like me, there's a good chance you actually played the Master System instead. And one of the most iconic games of the system was Alex Kidd in Miracle World. In fact, many versions of the console even had the game built directly into the system, which meant a lot of players experienced it from the moment they turned the console on. You play as Alex Kidd, a martial arts kid with enormous ears who punches rocks, rides motorcycles, and occasionally decides the best way to defeat a boss is to play rock, paper, scissors. Which, when you think about it, is probably the most Nintendo-like mechanism Sega ever put into a game. But weird mechanics aside, Alex Kidd in Miracle World became one of the defining games for the Master System era, long before Sega eventually replaced him with a certain blue hedgehog. Next is the Sega Mega Drive, known as the Sega Genesis in North America, launched in '88 in Japan and in '89 in the US. This was Sega's big answer to Nintendo's dominance, and their strategy was simple: make everything faster, louder, and cooler. The console powered a 16-bit processor, which at the time meant bigger, faster games and a lot more attitude. Sega even leaned into that rivalry with their famous marketing slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." Subtle? Absolutely not. Effective? Yes. One of the weirdest and most memorable games on the system was Earthworm Jim 2, released in 1995 by Shiny Entertainment. And yes, the name is exactly what it sounds like. You play as an earthworm inside a super-powered spacesuit, fighting bizarre enemies across absurd levels that range from launching cows into space to escorting a blind cave salamander. The game mixes platforming and shooting with incredibly creative level design, smooth animation, and a sense of humor that borders on complete nonsense. Earthworm Jim 2 became a cult classic on the Mega Drive era, proving that sometimes the best idea for a video game is apparently just, what if a worm found a spacesuit and everything got weird from there? I can't believe this game is over 30 years old. Even today, this game still looks amazing. Next on the list, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. Launched in 1990 in Japan, in 1991 in North America and 92 in Europe. The SNES was Nintendo's 16-bit powerhouse, with better graphics, better sound, and a library full of legendary games. Now, if you ask most people what the best SNES game is, they'll immediately say Super Mario World or The Legend of Zelda. And they were great, but honestly, I don't care. Because for me, the real star of the SNES was Star Fox, known in Europe as Starwing. Released in 1993, it used the legendary Super FX chip, which allowed the SNES to render actual 3D polygon graphics. Now it looks kinda weird, but back then, that looked absolutely insane. You play as Fox McCloud, flying the R-Wing through space battles, asteroid fields and enemy fleets to take down the mad scientist Andros. And while Mario was busy jumping on turtles and Link was running around smashing pots, I was flying a damn spaceship in 3D. The PlayStation launched back in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in North America and Europe, and it completely changed the gaming industry. Fun fact: the PlayStation actually exists because Nintendo screwed up a deal with Sony. Back in the early 90s, Sony and Nintendo were working together on a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. But at the last minute, Nintendo backed out of the deal publicly. Sony's response was simple: fine, we'll make our own console. And that decision ended up creating one of the most successful gaming systems ever made. The PSX, or PlayStation 1, quickly became home to legendary titles like Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2 and Metal Gear Solid. But my personal pick for the best PS1 game is Siphon Filter. You play as a special agent, Gabe Logan, uncovering a global conspiracy involving a deadly biological weapon called the Siphon Filter virus. And unlike certain stealth heroes, Gabe Logan actually fights back. The game mixes stealth, shooting and gadgets, but is mostly remembered for one very important thing, the taser. Because if you held that thing on an enemy long enough, they would literally catch on fire. And look, I know people will say Metal Gear Solid is the better stealth game, but personally I rather play as a guy who sets terrorists on fire with a taser than someone who hides in a cardboard box. Next, the Sega Saturn launched in 94 in Japan and 95 in the US and Europe. And technically speaking, it was a very powerful console for its time. Unfortunately, it was also a complete nightmare to develop for, thanks to its complicated dual CPU architecture, which meant that while Sega had great hardware, developers often had no idea what to do with it. Meanwhile, Sony showed up with the PlayStation and basically ran Sega over with a truck. But despite all, the Saturn still had some fantastic arcade-style games. One of the best examples is Virtua Cop 2. Originally released in arcades in 95, the Saturn version arrived in 96 and was almost a perfect port. This is a classic light gun shooter where you and your friend blast your way through criminals, bank robberies and car chases using the Sega Stunner light gun. The gameplay is fast, chaotic and very arcade-like. Enemies pop up everywhere and you have to react in milliseconds. And honestly, this game was a perfect reminder that sometimes you don't need complicated mechanics or deep storytelling. Sometimes you just need a plastic gun, a couch and a friend to yell at when they shoot the hostage. This console is easily my favorite Nintendo console, the Nintendo 64, and it launched in 1996, and it was Nintendo's big leap into the world of 3D gaming. And of course, the console is famous for games like Super Mario 64, which introduced full 3D platforming. I know this was a big deal and I loved our big-nosed Italian plumber in this amazing game, but let's be honest for a second. This was not the best game on the N64. That is GoldenEye 007, released in 1997 by Rare. James Bond, the secret agent with gadgets, guns, explosions and a license to kill. GoldenEye 007 was revolutionary for consoles. It has a full single-player campaign based on a movie, stealth mechanics, mission objectives, and of course the legendary 4-player split-screen multiplayer. I still have nightmares of dying to these proximity mines. If you grew up in the late 90s, you probably spent hours arguing with friends about screen cheating while trying to survive on maps like Facility or Complex. That is why, for me, the best game on the N64 will always be GoldenEye. The Dreamcast launched in 1998 in Japan and 1999 in the West. And for me, this was easily the coolest Sega console ever made. First of all, it had the best name in console history. I mean, come on, Dreamcast. Technically, the console was way ahead of its time. It had built-in internet features, an innovative controller with the little VMU memory card screen, and arcade quality graphics that were incredible for the late 90s. Unfortunately, the Dreamcast was also Sega's last console. Years of bad decisions and tough competition from Sony meant that Sega actually had to leave the console market entirely. Which is a shame because the Dreamcast actually had some amazing games. And my favorite, and this has to be yours too, Soul Calibur. Released in 1999, it was a weapon-based fighting game that looked absolutely stunning at the time. In fact, the Dreamcast version was even better than the arcade version, which almost never happened back then. With smooth gameplay, incredible graphics and a fantastic roster of characters, Soul Calibur quickly became one of the best fighting games of its generation. And honestly, if every Dreamcast game had been this good, maybe Sega would still be making consoles today. The PlayStation 2. Wow. It launched in 2000 and to this day it remains the best-selling console of all time. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. This thing had an absolutely insane library of games. We're talking about classics like GTA San Andreas, Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake Eater, God of War, and about 100 other games that could easily compete for the best PS2 game title. But for me, the PS2 isn't just another console, it's my favorite console of all time. And also in my opinion, the best looking console ever made. That black tower design with the blue PlayStation logo looks incredibly cool even today. And the very first game I bought for it was SSX 3. Now I know there are technically better PS2 games out there and more popular PS2 games out there, but SSX3 has a special place in my heart. It's an over-the-top snowboarding game where you race down massive mountains, pull insane tricks and blast through the snow at ridiculous speeds while the soundtrack keeps pumping in the background. And the coolest thing, the entire mountain was one giant seamless world, meaning you could ride from the very top all the way to the bottom without loading screens. And back then, that felt absolutely incredible, and it still does for me. PS2 honestly took over my childhood. I spent countless hours playing on that console, and SSX3 will always be that one PS2 game I simply could not have lived without. Now, if you can't live without items like these, make sure you like the video for the algorithm. It helps. And subscribe to the channel, so we are forever connected. The original Xbox launched in 2001, and this was Microsoft's first serious attempt to break into the console market. And unlike most consoles at the time, the Xbox was basically a small gaming PC in a box. It had a built-in hard drive, powerful graphics hardware and controllers that were, let's say, not designed for small human hands. One of the games that really showed what the Xbox could do was Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. Released in 2002 by Ubisoft. You play as Sam Fisher, a highly trained stealth operative working for the secretive Third Echelon program. Your job is simple: sneak through enemy facilities, gather intel, and eliminate threats without being seen. What made Splinter Cell so impressive at the time was its dynamic lighting and shadow system. Staying hidden in the dark wasn't just visual, it was actually a core gameplay mechanic. And it was just an awesome stealth game. This was 100% the most epic game on Xbox. After that, the Xbox 360 launched in 2005, and this was the console where Microsoft really started taking the console wars seriously. Xbox Live became a huge deal, online multiplayer exploded, and suddenly gaming with your friends online became the new normal. Now of course, when people talk about Xbox, they usually mention Fable. And look, I don't like running around in fantasy worlds with magic and fairy tale nonsense. For me, the game that truly defined the Xbox 360 was Gears of War. Released in 2006 by Epic Games, this game introduced the cover-based shooter mechanics that basically half the industry copied afterwards. You play as Marcus Phoenix, a soldier fighting against the monstrous Locust Horde in a brutal war for survival. The game was gritty, violent and loud, exactly what you expect from a game where your main weapon literally was a chainsaw attached to it. And honestly, if you have to choose between spells in Fairy Tale Kingdoms or cutting monsters in half with a chainsaw rifle, I think the choice is pretty obvious. The PlayStation 3 launched in 2006, and I'll be honest, this is probably my least favorite Sony console. The hardware was complicated, the launch price was ridiculously high, and Sony was clearly feeling a little too confident after the success of the PS2. But even though the console itself isn't my favorite, it did end up getting one of the greatest games ever made. In 2013, Naughty Dog released The Last of Us, and it completely raised the bar for storytelling in video games. This has to be everyone's #1 game for this console, right? The game follows Joel and Ellie, two survivors trying to make their way across a post-apocalyptic United States after a fungal infection has basically destroyed civilization. What makes the game so powerful isn't just the gameplay, which mixes stealth, combat and survival mechanics, but the relationship between the characters. Over the course of the journey, Joel and Ellie slowly form one of the most believable and emotional bonds ever seen in gaming. It even made this big, strong potato cry a little bit. The writing, the acting, the atmosphere, everything about this game was on another level. So while the PS3 might not be my favorite Sony console, it absolutely delivered one of the best games ever made. The Wii also launched in 2006, and instead of competing with Sony and Microsoft on raw power, Nintendo decided to do something completely different. They made a console where you actually had to stand up and move around like a lunatic in your living room. That's not what gamers sign up for. But somehow it worked. The Wii became a massive success, mostly thanks to one game, Wii Sports. And I say game with a bit of hesitation, because Wii Sports was basically the tech demo that came with the console. Suddenly people who had never played video game before were bowling, playing tennis and swinging imaginary golf clubs in their living rooms. And sometimes accidentally throwing a controller through the TV set. Literally everyone, including your mother, played this game. So while the Wii had plenty of other games, if we're being honest, Wii Sports is the one everyone remembers. Next is a bit of a sad story. After the Wii U launched in 2012, and unfortunately this ended up being one of Nintendo's biggest console failures. I liked it a lot, to be fair. But part of the problem was that a lot of people didn't even understand what it was. Was it a new console? Was it some kind of upgrade for the Wii? Even Nintendo marketing seemed a little bit confused about that. The system came with the gamepad, a controller with a big touchscreen built into it. It was actually a pretty interesting idea, but most gamers never really used it in a meaningful way. One game that did use it perfectly though was Super Mario Maker. Released in 2015, the game allowed players to create their own Mario levels. Using a simple editor on a Wii U gamepad, you could place blocks, enemies, pipes and power-ups exactly where you wanted them. It was basically Nintendo handing over the Mario level design tool and saying, "Here, go build your own Mario game." And for the first time, players could share their creations online and play levels made by other people around the world, which turned out to be a surprisingly fun idea, even if it still meant Mario spent most of the time jumping on turtles and hitting bricks with his hat. It's still Mario. The PlayStation 4 launched in 2013, and honestly, this might be the hardest console in this list to pick a single game from, because my god, the PS4 had an insane library of games, many of which people are still playing today. I could easily list titles that most people would call the best on the system. Uncharted 4, Killzone Shadowfall, Bloodborne, Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, The Last of Us Part 2, Ghost of Tsushima, the list just keeps going. For me, the game that defined the PS4 was Nioh, released in 2017 by Team Ninja. A brutally difficult action RPG set in a dark, supernatural version of feudal Japan, where you fight demons, samurai and basically anything else that wants to kill you. The combat is incredibly deep, fast and punishing, which means you will die. A lot. But when you finally master the mechanics and defeat a boss that's been destroying you for an hour, it feels absolutely amazing. And that's why for me, Nioh is the game that truly defined the PS4. The Xbox One launched in 2013, and honestly, this was a generation where I slowly started to drift away from Xbox. Microsoft made some really strange decisions with this console. At launch, it was heavily focused on TV, media and the Kinect instead of, actual games. And that didn't exactly help them win over gamers. While Sony was pushing big exclusives on the PS4, the Xbox One sometimes felt like it was still trying to figure out what it wanted to be. A problem that they never ever seemed to figure out until today. Because of that, I didn't actually play a lot of games on this console. But one title that really stood out to me was State of Decay by Undead Labs. Unlike most zombie games, this one focused heavily on survival and community management. You weren't just killing the zombies, you were building a base, managing survivors, scavenging for supplies, and trying to keep everyone alive. And the coolest part was that every character could permanently die, which made every decision feel important. It wasn't the biggest or most polished game in the system, but it was definitely one of the most interesting survival experiences I ever played. The Nintendo Switch launched in 2017, and once again Nintendo decided to do things their own way. Instead of competing with Sony and Microsoft on raw power, they built a console you could play on your TV and then take with you anywhere. Freaking brilliant! The Switch quickly became one of Nintendo's most successful consoles ever. Now, normally with these consoles I have to think pretty hard about which game deserves the top spot. But this time, no, this one is easy. The best game on the Switch is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Duh! The game completely reinvented the Zelda formula. Instead of linear dungeons and a fixed path, it gave players a massive open world and basically said, here, go explore. You can climb almost anything, glide across a map, experiment with physics and solve problems in ways the developers probably never even expected. The game actually released on the same day for the Wii U, which technically means that the best Switch game ever made was also the best Wii U game. PlayStation 5 launched in 2020, but the start of this generation was a bit rough. Because thanks to the global chip shortage and a whole lot of sick bats, actually getting your hands on a PS5 was almost harder than beating a Souls boss. I personally had to wait about a year and a half before I could finally buy one. And once you did get it though, the console was seriously impressive. The ultra-fast SSD meant almost no loading screens, and the DualSense controller added adaptive triggers and haptic feedback that actually made games feel different to play. Now, the game I'm about to mention isn't even a PlayStation exclusive, but it's the one that absolutely blew me away on the PS5. That game is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Wow, amazing. This dark fantasy action RPG mixes incredible visuals with turn-based combat and a world inspired by surreal French art. The atmosphere, the storytelling, and oh my god, the music. Everything just feels beautifully crafted. It's one of those rare games where you sit back and think, yeah, this is why I love gaming. Now, before the Xbox fans grab their pitchforks, the Xbox Series X and S do exist. But I'll be honest here, I actually don't own one. Like I mentioned earlier, I slowly drifted away from Xbox during the previous generation, and by the time these consoles released, I had already kind of moved on. And looking around, it sometimes feels like a lot of people did the same thing. Microsoft has been pushing Game Pass and services more than traditional console exclusives, which makes the whole Xbox ecosystem feel a little different than it used to. Recently, there have also been rumors and announcements about the next Xbox hardware, currently known as Project Helix, but honestly, I can't say I'm particularly excited about it yet. Maybe once we actually see what they're building and they show us some real games, I might get excited. And finally, the newest entry on this list, the Nintendo Switch 2. Nintendo once again doubled down on the hybrid idea, but this time with much more powerful hardware that can finally push their games into a proper modern generation of graphics and performance. Not a revolution, but a powerful evolution. Just like I am over humans. Now, the console is still relatively new, but one game that immediately stood out to me was Donkey Kong Bonanza. And honestly, what a fantastic game this is. Bonanza brings Donkey Kong back into the spotlight with classic platforming, chaotic action, and levels that are packed with secrets, collectibles, and ridiculous destruction. The gameplay is fast, colorful, and full of personality. Exactly what you want from a Donkey Kong game. And after all these years of Mario constantly stealing the spotlight, it's actually nice to see Donkey Kong finally getting his moment again. So while the Switch 2 generation is only just getting started, if this is the kind of game we can expect from it, the future is looking pretty good. So, those were my picks for the best game on every console. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like. It really helps the channel out. And subscribe, because that's what keeps me going. And before you start typing angry comments, yes, I know, I probably missed your favorite game. So go ahead and tell me which game I got completely wrong. And remember, you're allowed to disagree, you're just not allowed to be right. Stay strong, potatoes.